Soccer, fantastic game, exciting, fast-paced, and it's good for the cardiovascular system. Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen Skyver. Several years ago, I became involved in the coaching of young children in soccer. Unfortunately, prior to this period of time, I had no prior experience with working with this age group. I was, however, lucky enough to be introduced to it through the North American Soccer Camp program. The teaching that they use is both innovative and extremely useful. It was through a series of meetings with Dr. Gary Russell that these videotapes came about. I found Dr. Gary Russell to combine the latest in educational concepts with the finest in soccer instruction, and through it he's revolutionized the coaching of soccer in this country. With us today in the studio is Dr. Gary Russell, the founder and president of North American Soccer Camp, and Derek Hoare, a North American Soccer Camp coach. Now, Derek, why don't you tell us what you feel is the most unique about these particular soccer tapes?
I think what we have here is a set of original tapes that we try and use average children. We could have gone out and got very talented children, but what we'd have done then is really shown things that weren't really going to happen to the coach out in the field. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to help the coaches out there and show them on the tapes what they were going to get actually with their children at their coaching sessions. In combination with Dr. Russell's educational work, I think we do have a set of original tapes there that will be useful to all coaches, whatever level they are coaching at.
Gary, why don't you tell us about the particular educational concepts that you do discuss?
Yeah, what I basically have found over the last 15 years is that we were approaching, at least I felt we were approaching children from the wrong point of view. All the materials that had been developed were basically all what I would call sender-oriented, and little regard was taken in terms of the child. How does the child think? At what stages can they do certain things? And what we call our receiver qualities. So what we've put together is a series of expert instruction through the efforts of people like Derek, and we've combined that with the educational philosophy that will match so that we can then begin to ask children to do certain things at the ages that they're appropriate to do them, and thus building in the whole concept of success. And that's what the whole essence of the program is all about.
Okay, well, let's go to the classroom now and talk more about the particular educational concepts that Dr. Russell uses.
One of the receptor qualities in taking a look at our teaching or coaching is taking a look at the child and his or her thinking. What we have done in this country, both in education and in industry and coaching, is that we focus more on program level. If we look at all the manuals or books and so on, we see program level. In our company, we happen to have 3 different programs, one being Nippers for small kids, Team and Select and Travel for medium-aged kids, and varsity programs. And this is one of the problems that we create, because what we try to do with this is make kids match a program. And unfortunately, children don't do that. I don't know why God did that, but He had something in mind. What we really need to do is do the opposite, and that is to focus on the child as a receiver. We need to understand the developmental levels that are involved in coaching. If we take a look at the developmental level of thinking in children, and we understand thinking and what happens at various ages, then we can eventually create programs that match it. But unless we understand this, we're going to struggle. Let me begin. The child is born in what is called pre-operational thought stage, which is basically from the ages of 2 to 6. And again, the thing I want you to realize is that this is a matrix, and it's a way to explain things, but children are not a matrix. Children do not go as evenly as I'm going to share with you in terms of numbers. We have an overlap, which we'll explain. But pre-operational thought stage is basically from the ages of 2 to about 6, depending on the child. We then move from age 7 through about 11, which is concrete operational thought. And obviously there are characteristics that match this level of thinking. About the age of 12 and 13, we move into what's called formal operational thought. All of these receiving qualities of a child affect what we're going to teach. If we're taking a look at soccer in terms of progression, now we take a look at soccerness, or the soccer that's involved. And we could do this with math, we could do this with English, but in this case I'm going to use soccer. I would have put teaching of other things in here, but I've spent all my money on this, and it's the best I could do, so please follow along. The soccer progression that matches young children at pre-operational thought is the teaching of technique. Technique is the ability to associate one's body with the ball. And for young children, that's enough. The next stage of thought, which is basically, again, from 7 to 11, involves skill. Skill is the application of technique. Until a person understands their body awareness around a ball, skill is now the application of technique, and skill can only occur in pressurized situations where it's developed. If we start kids, for instance, in games too soon, without having this progression, they won't ever learn the game properly. And lastly, when we get to kids that are basically 12 and up, we're looking at developing tactics, or how do we involve kids into a full game that involves positions and tactical situations. There is a progression. As there is to thinking, there's a progression to soccerness. Lastly, after we have this very clear, then we can go back and call them whatever we want to call them. In this case, for the technique level, with the young children, we call it nippers for pre-operational thought. For kids that are basically, again, 7 through 11, we call it team and select. You can call it bologna and cheese. It really doesn't matter at this point. The understanding is this, moving to this. And lastly, we call our older kids program that involve tactics, who have an ability to think at a higher level, we call that our varsity program. What I'd like to do now is just remind you to keep in mind that these characteristics that we're talking about with children are not conjecture on my part. Yes, I've put about 20 years of research and experience to this into a program that works. But what we're putting together are theories and research that has been done by many people who are very astute in the field of psychology and education. What I'd like to move into now is the next stage of development, which is called concrete operational thought. And that stage of development begins basically at around the age of 7. 7 through about 11 or 12, again, depending on the child. What you got to realize at this stage of development is probably the most critical stage that we have to face, whether it's in education or whether it's a parent or whether we're coaching, because you can realize that between 7 and 11 there is tremendous growth, not only in terms of the child physically, but socially, emotionally as well, and thinking-wise, which I'm going to go over in a second. Let's talk about a little bit about social and emotional development at this age. What we're dealing with is the child who begins to believe that he can be involved in our world. He's very interested in being successful, being very interested in being industrious, if we want to use Erickson's word. A person who begins to get a picture in their mind about how they fit into this world. So the whole picture that they must grasp is that they can do something successfully. And this, again, involved in school or sport or wherever we may be, is that so important that we don't introduce the concept of failure to these kids, because that picture develops one thing: I can't do anything. And what they begin to do is behave like a failing person does. That is, the loop gets complete, I begin to act up, and I begin to be a failure type person. What characteristics can we look for at this stage? And again, a wide spread between where we start and where we end up. So if you listen to this, visualize, if you will, a continuum of thinking that goes on. We already mentioned the fact of decentering. At this age level, we'll be able to realize that a child is decentering. They're able to see more than one attribute of something. In school, it might be a characteristic of a thought of something that's not just black, it's also black and white. There are 2 attributes plus. There are some kids who are even beyond this. I had a person mention to me in a workshop once that when I go over these characteristics that, well, you're not being fair enough to children, because some of these kids can go beyond that. Certainly they can. But what I want you to realize is that there are kids all over the place who may look the same, may be the same size, they may be the same age, but their thinking can be different, and that's going to affect what we teach. The other thing that we noticed about kids at this age is that they can begin to realize that there's systems within systems. There's rules in a classroom as well as a classroom that apply to not only me but to others. In sport, I play a particular position, but I'm also a member of a team. He begins to analyze things beyond just the appearance of something. He now collects his experiences. He has recall. He's able to think back on something that we did last week. For some kids in pre-operational thought, just remembering who they are is difficult from day to day, let alone what we're doing. They now begin to develop a concept called reversibility, which means they can go through something and then they can back it up. They have the confidence that that's going to happen. They solve problems this way by backing it up. They can go through an activity, and if you ask them to go back through it, to kind of show the videotape back over again, they understand what you're talking about now. They recognize for the first time, and again it's somewhere along here for some kids, that a team or a classroom actually has a logical structure. There are components that make this thing up. What you got to realize, especially in sport, is that most people in the rest of the world, when it comes to sport, other than this country, and perhaps basketball in the United States is indicative of this, is that many of the kids involved in sport don't get involved in a formal way until about the age of 11 or 12. Same way here in the United States with basketball. So you can see that formalizing things too early is a very difficult proposition. Composition is another topic that we want to talk about. Recognizes parts of the whole. That's composition in terms of how a child develops. Associativity rearranges group elements with the confidence that when they rearrange them, they can be put back the way they originally intended to be. Recognizing that there's classification, that there's increasingly groups within a whole group. In sport, and let's use soccer as an example, we realize that there are fullbacks, halfbacks, and line people. Until this level of thought comes into mind, there is no connection between the two. The other deceiving thing about children at this age is that their language develops a lot faster than their thinking, which means very simply that they'll be able to parrot back to you as an adult what you've said, but the thought process of what it actually intends to be is behind it. A typical child in soccer, for example, at age 7, who gets involved in being a fullback, he can tell you he's a fullback, he can parrot it back, but when it comes to associating it to an actual function, he doesn't have it. And that's why you see it perhaps more graphically in soccer and basketball as well, is that they have a tendency to follow the ball around rather than stay to the function that you've asked. This is a thinking process. This is not a sport process or a classroom process. This is a receiver quality that unless we understand this, we're going to be missing the target with many children. Hi, we'd like to welcome you back from the classroom. Through the magic of video, we'd like to go to the soccer field where we can actually match our soccer instruction to our development of thinking in children. Let's go to the field.
Here we've got our first technique, control, actually demonstrated by one of our coaches, Jed Murphy. Here you can see the ball's been rolled in, and he's actually doing the first part of the technique, which is controlling the ball by selecting the surface. Here he's chosen the widest surface area, the side of the foot.
I think it's important to realize also here that what we're doing for children is giving them visual pictures. The perceptions that are developed in the brain is about approximately 80%, which are visual. And this is exactly what our coach is doing, giving good, clear pictures for children.
There you can see the second coaching point that comes up as well is the coach, the player, has to absorb the pace off the ball. And this is done by withdrawing the surface or cushioning the ball. And you can see in this slow motion piece that as the ball arrives, Jed moves the foot away, which allows the ball to stop, and then he can play the next move, which could be a pass or it could be a shot, or even it might be dribbling off. Here we've got the coach once again demonstrating now thigh control. He's using the fleshy part of the thigh to cushion the ball, and he withdraws the surface as it arrives.
I think what we also should realize here, Derek, with watching Mick back up, is that children can only do basically one thing at a time. Control's one thing. Movement and control is a very difficult concept. You'll notice here, Derek, that the girl behind our instructor is copying the very picture that he creates, which is exactly what you need.
Here you can see again we're working on just control. The coach is using the upper chest area, this time that's the surface selected, and he can cushion the ball by bending the knees and arching the back. And here you can see in diagram 1 how we begin looking at this technique. S, the server, serves the ball to X, to whichever surface we're going to be working on for this particular practice. Here we can now see the children actually carrying out the practice. The ball's rolled in along the ground to the partner, and you can see that the child's shown a good example of controlling the ball, selecting the surface and absorbing the pace.
What you'll notice here is this child has a very difficult time relaxing the surface, cushioning the ball, which is very typical of young children.
The same practice is carried out here, but it's important that the feed is correct. Here you see the feed, it's just not quick enough, so the actual technique of controlling is not needed even to stop the ball. Here we have thigh control. What I find interesting here, Gary, is how come the lad can do this yet really struggle with foot control?
What we find is this is a brand new technique for the child, so he's following what we've asked him to do. With the foot control, he's done that perhaps for years, and he's done it wrong and doesn't know how to change it.
Once again, we're trying to work on thigh control, but the girl just hasn't got the confidence to actually select the surface, the thigh, and control the ball. And this is where the coach really plays a big part. He's actually going in and will improve that girl in a short, very short span indeed, by building the confidence. Firstly, he gets her close enough so she's got a chance to actually get some success. At least she makes an attempt this time to control the ball. As you can see on this attempt, she really does well and the ball drops down nicely for her to play it off. The coach then reintroduces her partner and you can see the amount of success in a short time. And as demonstrated by the coaches earlier, now we can move on to chest control. You can see the child attempting to bend the knees and arch the back in order to pull the ball down. The final example is a very good attempt in a controlled situation. Gary, what I'd like to say here is, why is the child here, when we've been trying to work on chest control, why has he decided to try and control it with a different surface?
He's thinking about his chest. He's centering in on one attribute of himself. And what he does when the ball goes low, he simply follows the ball down. Some children would put their foot over top of the head. They do a lot of things that we look upon as being strange. Let's continue on.
So just in summary, we can see that we've really looked at two major coaching points: selecting the surface and absorbing the pace. Third very important point is getting in line with the ball, and here we've got a coach explaining this key factor.
Very often in a soccer game, if we stood still to receive a ball like this, what we'd find is a defender who may be close to us might suddenly move in front of us to receive the ball first. So what we do now, we try to add a little bit more movement, so I'm actually going to move towards my partner and I'm going to start communicating with him, because in a team game it's important we have some verbal communication. So when I want the ball passed to my feet, I'm going to shout, "Yes, Dave," or "Dave," or "Now." So as long as there's some more communication so he understands when I want the ball passed to me. So from this position, I'm going to move forward to receive a ball, and I don't want to be still going forward when I make contact with the ball, but I actually want to relax when I get to the ball. So I relax myself, I relax the surface, just preventing any defender from trying to get round in front of me. So we start from here, and we say, "Yes, Dave," and we come in, and the ball comes, relax, pass back. Then we just jog back to here, and shout, "Yes, Dave," and we come in, relax, and pass back. From here, we'd be in, "Yes, Dave," in, relax, and pass back. On the same line, we might want to think about moving this way or that way perhaps, because we don't always want to play straight back towards our partner. Now the problem the children have at this point is that if the ball is passed to one side of them, their feet tend not to move an awful lot. So what we want them to do is not to stick a foot out, because if we put a foot out there, the chances are the ball might go over the foot, or if we put a thigh out there, it might hit the thigh there and bounce out behind us. And also if a defender was here, he can easily see the ball come through and make a clearance. So what we want to do is, if the ball was played to this side, I'd want to come across and get my body actually behind the ball, as we call it, in line with the ball. Same if it came to this side, I want to come off at an angle and get my body in line with the ball again. So we'll see what happens on this one. So I'm going to go to the right, then I'll go to the left, just to have a little bit of variation. I still communicate with my partner. So we start from here, I pretend that's the defender there, and he runs in, I shout, "Yes, Dave," and I try to get my body in line with the ball, back to the middle.
Here we have the cone acting as the point by which a child can recall where they need to run back to. Without that, they'd struggle.
In these two examples here of thigh and chest control, you can now see that we're adding a further complication for the child. He's actually having to move to get in line with the ball as well as controlling. As the diagram shows, the server stands approximately 5 yards apart and serves the ball to the either side cone, and X1 then moves to control. And here we have a child actually carrying out the practice. The coach is serving the ball and he's moving side to side. Gary, would you say that this child is in the concrete operational thought stage? How do you assess the performance of this child?
He's definitely in concrete operational thought, but what we got to realize is at the upper end of it. What we're talking about here is there are psychological factors as well as physical factors. He's able to understand the practice, he's able to move, and he's able to do the things that you're asking him to do.
So obviously what the coach can do is once the child has achieved success at this practice, he can then just serve it wherever he needs to, and this actually assimilates the game situation. Now we can move on and look at the small-sided game situation, 3 versus 1. As you can see in the diagram, we have 3 X's playing against D, the defender. The point of the practice is to work on the first controlling touch. D plays the ball to either X1, X2 or X3, who control, and then they combine together to get a shot at goal. As we could see illustrated in the diagram, here's the first touch. This is what we're trying to coach in this practice. Once the lad has controlled the ball, as pointed out, they now try and combine to get a shot at goal. Even at this young age, you can see how the 2 children supporting have spread out to give her many, many options. We now develop this on to look at 3 versus 2, bring in more factors. Once again, the defender serves the ball, and now 3 against 2. Once again, the children are trying to combine, but remember the thing we're looking for in this practice, it's the first touch, the controlling touch. If they score a goal as they did then that's a bonus. Once we've looked at the basic technique of control, we can go on and look at something a little bit more developed, controlling the ball into space. Here, this practice, S, the server, serves it to X, and he tries to control the ball to the side, taking it to one of the end cones. Here in the practice, you can see the coach using the inside of the foot on that example, and coming up using the outside of the foot to take the ball away from the defender and into the space where he may be able to pass the ball. We develop on and now do the same practice, but of course we're using a different surface. We now look at the thigh. The first example taking it to the right, and there taking it to the left. We can see the children performing the practice just carried out by the coaches. In the first example, the defender there moved before the attacker had touched the ball. We must make sure that the defender doesn't move until the attacker touches the ball to give a chance of success. Here now we've added a direction to it. Instead of going to the side, we're now asking the attacker to try and beat the defender. Note in this example that the way the player takes him on and takes it to the end cone. Here, watch how he controls it to the side to make it more difficult for the defender to come and get the ball. In this practice, we're looking to control the ball with the first touch into space, and you can see we're now expecting the children to have a little bit more movement. The first touch is to control, and the second touch is to pass off. See the use of the outside of the foot there to move the ball to exactly where he wanted to make the next pass. Here in the diagram you can see X1 plays to X2, X2 controls and plays back to X1, who plays then to X3, working both ways through the grid. Here's an example of the young players performing this practice. You can see that although it's not as crisp as when the coaches performed it, they're still working on having their first touch, making it a good first touch so it goes into the space for them to make the next pass. Here this young lad doesn't make a good first touch and it creates a problem for his pass. Here again you can see that this lad plays one touch. That doesn't create a problem, but remember what our emphasis is. There's another example of the outstretched foot as well, instead of getting in line with the ball. What we try and do now is move on to the functional practice, and here you can see in the diagram coming up we've got X1 who throws the ball in to X2 who controls and turns, controlling the ball into the space, who plays the ball back to X1 and plays off to X3. And we've got a defender to make it more game related.
Derek, I think it's important for our viewers to realize, why is it so important to do these functional practices?
We need to have the ability as coaches to take the child on from just technique practices, and by introducing this type of thing with a defender, it makes it more game related for them, keeps them more interested.
I thought that was an interesting move to give kids, again, that visualness to see what we're all about.
You can see, although the child doesn't perform it perfectly, he's made an attempt to step over the ball, and he's just invented that for himself. Now what we're looking to move on to is actually controlling the ball but turning in the same movement. And here you see the coaches are just demonstrating this practice. You can see that the coach is using all the surfaces to turn the ball. Outside of the foot being used and the inside of the foot being used. And the thing to notice here is that it's all done in one movement, the controlling touch and the actual turning itself. It's not two separate issues. Here's the diagram explaining it. X1 plays to X2, who controls with the first touch and plays off to X3 with his second touch, and then it happens working the opposite direction.
I think it's important to realize here, Derek, that we're at the upper end of concrete operational thought with children. This young lad not only can control, he turns and he puts pace to the ball, and he does it so smoothly.
There you can see the point that we brought out. He's actually turned and controlled in one move. A little bit different to this example, Gary.
Yeah, I think what we'll see here is a young lad who needs, at the bottom end of the spectrum, he's younger, he needs someone to demonstrate to him what part of the foot to use. Derek, what I'd like to point out is the expression on this young lad's face, because to me this is one of the precious moments that we have as a coach. Here's a child desperately struggling to follow every word that you've given to him, and when he makes a mistake trying to get his body in order, he realizes it is a mistake, and he looks up to you as if to say, please don't yell at me for doing something dumb. And I bring this up because it's not just soccer that we're talking about here. We're talking about a child who can be crushed by the very words that we use in any given moment. And I just think it's important that we focus on the psychological factors as well as the thinking and the soccerness involved with our kids. So let's move on again.
Here you can see the coach is demonstrating another practice, and all it is a development of controlling the ball into the space that you want to play off to next. As you can see in diagram here, we've got 4 X's in a 20 by 20 square and X1 in the middle of the square. The ball's played into the middleman, who controls the ball into the space and plays it off to a player who has not received the ball. Really, we're working on here on, once again, the controlling the ball with the first touch into the area where we want to play our second pass. Here we can see the children taking part in the practice. The child passes it in, controls it into the space and plays it off, and the use of the cones there so he can actually start there, and we're trying to get him to encourage to move away from the ball and then move back in. Here's a great example of him not controlling the ball into the space that he wants to play off to, and as you can see with the resulting pass, he's created himself a real problem. Remember one of the early points we brought out of getting in line with the ball, and here we can see, because we've moved on, the child's forgotten that point and he just stretches out a leg and misses the ball completely. So it's important that we keep refocusing the child on all those key factors.
I think the exciting thing here, Derek, is that we take a static situation, a technique, and we bring it to life. And we give children a visual picture of what it's all about. This is a perfect example why these tapes can be viewed by children.
And just to explain that practice, Gary, we've got here the same practice, but we've introduced a defender now to make it once again more realistic for the child to actually control the ball, but the defender is a passive defender. Remember, we want success. And here we've got the children carrying out the same practice. Ball's played in, delivers it, plays it into the space, and with his second touch plays it off to his partner. I think something that really is impressive here for this young lad is the way you can see he's moving away from the space to take the defender with him, and then moves back into the space where he wants to receive the ball. And here we've got the lad is actually screening the ball with his body so that the defender can't get a foot in. And here you can see with that first touch he plays it perfectly so that his second touch is going to be a pass to his teammate is made so much easier. What we can do now is develop this onto a functional practice so that the practice actually finishes with a shot at goal.
I think what's important here, Derek, is to realize that we as adults know where these things fit into a field. A child doesn't, so actually placing it in the place where it's going to happen in a game is very important for their instruction.
And I think you can see from that clip that even the coaches are enjoying that type of practice, and that's important to keep the interest for the children. Just to show the organisation of the practice, we have a 30 by 20 yard area. S, the server, serves the ball into X1, who controls the ball into the space and plays it off to either X2 or X3. They can take a shot at goal or even combine back again with X1 to get a shot in at goal. D, the defender, puts X1 under pressure to begin with, just passive pressure, but then in a full game situation. Here we have the children performing this practice. As you can see, they elect to actually combine and finish with a shot at goal. But we'd like to take a little bit more time and look at that again in slow motion. Here we can see the attacker initially moves away from the space where he wants the ball played into. That's a very important point. Once the ball arrives into the space, here we can see with the first touch, he plays the ball across his body, using his body to screen the ball into the space where he wants to next play the pass. The defender is putting him under quite severe pressure, but because of the use of the body, we can get away and screen the ball quite well. When we can see, we move on with an excellent first touch. He can now play off to the wide player. The wide player selects to combine back with the striker and plays it back in. Watch again the quality of the first touch of both these players. He just passes it to himself and has plenty of time to shoot the ball to the corner, leaving the goalkeeper with no chance at all.
Passing is another important technique in the game, and perhaps it's one of the things we first deal with. And there are a few coaching points we need to introduce to the children. Firstly, the surface we're looking to pass the ball with. It's the biggest surface, the widest surface, the inside of the foot. So we address the ball and play through the ball by using the inside of the foot. The other surface we can use is the big, wide outside surface of the foot. Once again, this time, sometimes it enables us to pass the ball using disguise. Once we've got the correct surface, it's important we face the direction of the person we're passing to, and when we kick the ball, it's through the midline of the ball, so the ball rolls truly along the ground. A further aspect of the game is the use of the non-kicking foot. Very important, it goes by the side of the ball, pointing in the direction that we want to pass the ball to.
Here you can see in this practice, the lads are passing the ball across a 10-yard area, and obviously you can vary this. The younger the children, the shorter the distance should be, and they're also following the ball. So we're trying to introduce the technique of passing with the side of the foot and also following the ball. Here we're just using a different surface, using the outside of the foot. Once again, the children may have a problem early on, but just for them to experience the feeling of using the outside of the foot is well worthwhile.
I think what's interesting here, Derek, is that we now create some more visualness. We give them short, successful steps and a target that they can actually complete.
Here you can see in the diagram, X1 plays the ball through X2's legs and X3 receives it. And as Gary's just pointed out, this makes the practice far more interesting than just having two children passing across a grid for 5 yards. They'll get bored very, very quickly just carrying out that practice. And here we can see an example of the children performing this practice. Here is a great example of the child not actually just following the basic key factors. The child hasn't got his foot next to the ball and he's not really facing the direction of the pass, which is ultimately going to cause a problem for him. As you can see, when he passes the ball, it's not very accurate because of that reason.
You know, Derek, you're right. Here it's so easy for a child to make a mistake because what we've introduced is not only the technique but the complex part of movement, which very simply causes his problems.
Here we've got a 20 by 20 square and 6 players in the area. The 2 X's combined together, just passing the ball, as well as the other 2 pairs. Here's the example of the practice. You can see the children are moving around, passing the ball back and 2.
What you're going to find here, Derek, is that we're going to create a practice where all different levels of thinking is going on here. You got some kids who are doing this practice very well, and then you have the young girl in the blue shorts who obviously is trying very hard, but she doesn't really understand it other than you move just back and forth, which is totally different than the other children.
To develop the practice, what we can do now is introduce 5 children into the grid, and what we're doing is X1 will look to pass to X2, X2 to X3, and so on, and X5 finishes by passing back to X1, working again on passing, movement, and more importantly, getting their head up to make sure they can see their partner and see where they're going to pass to. Also, in this practice, verbal communication becomes very important. We want to encourage the children to call for the ball to help their teammates.
Look at the difference in a short amount of time of what's happening with these children. This group of kids are moving more, they actually look like they're calling for the ball, and they're gaining a lot of success.
Here you can see this girl has received the pass from one direction, but she's really made an effort to turn around the ball and pass it in the opposite direction, and this practice really develops that. And here in this diagram, once again, we're just trying to develop on the same notion, pass and move. We've got the X's around the grid, and they pass the ball across the grid, and they follow the ball and exchange places with the person they've passed the ball to. Something that you need to watch in this practice is we start obviously with one ball. That's really so we can get some success. As we move on in the practice, we can introduce more soccer balls.
What I want to point out to our viewer is that our children in this clip are just ordinary players, typical things that we would go through with any group of kids. And I want to point that out because watch what they do. They pass the ball and they're supposed to run after the ball and they don't do that. And all of a sudden, boom, it clicks in. That's a very important step in development for kids. They need this sequence, it's called cognitive schemes, where they build on one step to the other. Without that opportunity to build that sequence, they're not going to develop into players who can play in a game.
And I think that's an important point to note because, as you can see, some coaches might be thinking that this practice isn't working as well as it should do. This is the start, the first time the children have done it, and obviously as they do it more and practice more, it'll just get better. What we can move on to now is passing and support. Another good word for support for young children is help. And here you can see in this practice, what we're trying to do is talk about 2 key factors. Talking about the angle of support and the distance of support. And here's the diagram just explaining the practice. D, who's the defender, plays the ball to X1, X2 or X3, and they must try and keep the ball within the 10 by 10 square, playing the ball ideally along the ground and make 5 or 6 passes. And here's an example of the practice taking place. As you can see, we've got a defender in there, but he's a restricted defender. He can only move on all 4s, and this allows the children to get some success. As the children develop, then we might give that defender a little bit more movement. He's now crawling on all 4s. And then we develop further, the defender's now allowed to walk around the grid. And if you're still getting success at this level, then of course you can make him a full defender. But don't expect too much too early, because this is quite a difficult skill to perform. Here's a further development of the practice. We've got 6 versus 2, 6 X's are playing against D1 and D2. The point of the practice is to get the X's passing the ball around the grid, trying to make sure that they can pass and avoid the 2 defenders.
Derek, one of the things I'd like to point out in this diagram, which is something that might slide by if we didn't point it out, is here we have a situation where we have 6 people against 2. And it's well structured, it's set up properly by our coach, and the biggest thing that's setting up besides soccer instruction is the whole concept of success. The children on the outside are going to reach success because it's weighted in favor of the people who are doing the actual technique and skill that we're working on here. And that's important because success, as we all know, leads to excellence, and excellence leads to achievement. And it's another stepping stone in our process, which I'm very excited about.
Another thing that they do in a developmental way is the concept of adding variables. In this country, what we normally do is play 11 aside too soon. Here, where they're going to struggle with playing 6 against 2, they need time to develop this concept of adding variables to the play. They need this to help them understand how to interchange and how to pass back and forth between people. Notice as well, as we get a pass from this player, he doesn't know what to do, and the coach plays an integral part in what to do here. It's a good point. He gives the direction, which also helps the child make the practice a success.
In the next diagram, 7, what we've done is add a direction to the practice. Y's play against the X's. When the X's have possession, 2 of the Y's have to become goalkeepers, therefore playing 3 X's against 1 Y. And the same occurs when the Y's get the ball. 2 X's become goalkeepers. Here you can see in the practice the X's have the ball, so the 2 Y's are in goal. As soon as possession changes to the Y's, then 2 of the X's retreat and become goalkeepers, as pointed out, to play 3 against 1. All we're looking for is to get as many passes and in the end a shot at goal. Once again, to stimulate the interest of the children, what we need to do once we've got them playing, passing the ball and taking on defenders, we need to add a direction to it. And this is an excellent practice you can use, and they're playing the ball now towards a goal. And here in the diagram shows the practice we've just seen. X1 and X2 combine to go past the defender in that restricted area. If X1 carries the ball past the defender, then he has another 10 yards to compose himself, and then he can combine with X3 in a pass or a dribble to beat the defender again. Remember, what we're trying to encourage in this practice is passing. So if they do dribble, then don't worry about that, but remember we're trying to work on the passing element.
What we've subtly done, Derek, is we've built on the space. It's not something the children are aware of, but obviously we've introduced more variables now. The space is larger, and what we're ultimately getting to is building into a full-sided game.
Here you can see that these children are the top spectrum of the concrete operational thought stage, and they're performing that skill very well. Something we need to mention here is the weighting of a pass. Here, the pass from the lad is not hard enough, and when we unfreeze this, you can see that he has to slow down to receive the ball. This one is overweighted, it's kicked too hard, so in a normal game situation, he would lose possession. It's very important that we work on weighting of passes. We'd like to now look at the wall pass, or sometimes called the 1-2. This is an excellent method of beating a defender. Let's have a closer look at it. As the attacker gets the ball, he dribbles it towards the defender, and it's important that he commits him before he passes the ball. Once he passes the ball off, then the person that you can see coming into the picture now and highlighted, he's the vital player, he's the wall pass player. Have a look the way his body is opened up to the play so he can actually see the direction that they're going in. He also plays one touch and he returns it to a similar return angle. Once the player has received the ball back, then he can sprint on. As pointed out, this is an excellent way of beating one player. Here you can see the diagram explaining the practice. X starts with the ball and takes it to D, the defender. He plays the ball to X1, and X1 is the person who's got to play one touch, returns it to X, who has gone beyond D, and now makes his way to the end of the grid. And here's the example of the children performing this skill.
As we build on, Derek, we're going to move to a 5v2 situation. And as a person growing up in the United States, I think one of the things that I've learned that around the world, What you're seeing now is 5v2 with adults, and that's what we would see at every professional club around the world. These people can do it cognitively, but most importantly, it's easier to coach a small area and fewer variables. Don't you agree?
That's exactly right, and you can see that the coach is using different surfaces outside and inside of the foot there. And here we can see the children performing the same practice. Great examples of using all the surfaces outside and inside of the foot to pass. And this is a great example of the practice being performed very, very well. Don't expect to get this immediately. There's a great example of a wall pass. Passed it off, committed the defender, made a good run and received the ball again.
I'd like to bring up now, Derek, is something that perhaps we shouldn't be so candid about, but I will be to make a point to our viewer. What we're going to see in a second is something that we create, and that's where a child does something because we've asked him to do it rather than it's really needed. Notice he makes a wall pass when there isn't any real need to do it. And that's something that we have to be very carefully that we don't overload someone with our instruction. This next section is on aerial passing, and it would seem at a casual glance, Derek, that we might be introducing something that was even too difficult for the upper end of concrete operational thought. Why do this now?
I think it's a good point. Here, just to explain the diagram, we've got x2 plays to x1, and x1 plays the ball over x2 to x3. And what we're trying to do is get the child performing to a certain level. Here, we've got the key factors that we'd have to introduce to the children. What we've tried to do is get the child to perform this technique in a very unpressured situation. There's no defenders around, and you'll see with the clip coming up that the child can perform the technique very well. So I think it's important that we get him doing this as early as possible. But let's be, again, realistic that you won't get many 9, 10, 11-year-olds who can chip the ball or pass it aerially like that.
Shooting is a very important aspect of the game, obviously, because goals win games for us. And we find, and as children progress, that many of the shots are off target.
It's bent it round and it's gone into the goal. Barry's turn. He'll approach the ball from the angle and bend it round the wall into the far corner of the goal, hopefully.
What the blue? Right, get tight.
Good one. Finish was a bit rank. Keep going, Dick.
Hit your arm up.
That's it, and just exaggerate the non-follow through.